So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Business Over Breakfast with Emory Executive Education. My name is Nicola Barrett, and I'm Chief Corporate Learning Officer here at the Goizueta Business School. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. Paul Wolpe, Director for the Center for Ethics at Emory University, to join us for a conversation about ethics and why organizations often get it wrong. With heightened expectations of employees, consumers, suppliers, shareholders, and governmental agencies, coupled with the speed of technology allowing new models of business, ethics is at the forefront of a national and international conversation. We need to look no further than the recent headlines for proof of poor decisions and poor choices made by executives. Before we get started, though, I'd like to share a bit more about Paul and his very impressive credentials, which, Paul, I'm going to have to read because you have a long list. So in addition to his role as director for Emory's Center for Ethics, Paul is a distinguished research chair of Jewish bioethics, professor of medicine, pediatric psychiatry, and sociology. His scholarly work focuses on the social, religious, and ideological impact of medicine, technology, and biotechnology on the human condition, as well as general ethical thought. He served in many leadership roles with esteemed organizations such as the American Journal of Bioethics, Neuroscience, the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and the Hastings Center, to name a few. He is considered a bit of a rock star among ethicists, and he served as the first chief of bioethics for NASA, was named one of Trust Across America's top 100 thought leaders in trustworthy business behavior, and was profiled by Atlantic Magazine as a brave thinker. As with most of our sessions, Paul is going to spend about 30-35 minutes sharing perspectives on today's business ethics challenges, and that's going to be followed by a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible. And if you're looking for ways to reinvigorate your mind, update your skills, please, I invite you to join us for our back to school open enrollment courses, courses including executive communications, design thinking for business innovation, disrupting your business strategy, among others. And you can find details of those on the website, on the executive education website. And so we'll post a link in chat for that. And so now, please, looking forward to hearing from you, Paul, and everybody enjoy your morning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicola. So welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. I want to do something different, a little quirky. I always try to do something a little quirky. I was listening to Jack Nicklaus being interviewed once, and he said that once a year, he goes back to his original golf teacher, and he walks in and he starts from scratch. The golf teacher says, "Now let me show you how you hold a club. Let me show you how you swing a club." And he starts from scratch as if this is the greatest golfer in the world at the time. And he goes back to zero to relearn his basic skills once a year. With that idea in mind, what I'd like to do is, instead of doing what's often done in business ethics, which is give you cases and talk about the details, I want to start at the beginning, because I have a somewhat idiosyncratic view of ethics. And so I really welcome your input and your thoughts as we go on and at the end. And I'll start by a quote. Aristotle said, "We ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth," as his teacher Plato taught him, "so as to both delight in and be pained by the things that we ought." In other words, what he's saying is ethics isn't easy. It pains us. It's difficult. It's not, we like to say ethics is not for sissies. Sometimes you have to make really tough ethical decisions, but there is a certain pleasure, a certain satisfaction in behaving ethically. I'm going to talk about 6 aspects of ethics that I think are misunderstood. Misunderstood might not be the best word. We know these things, or many of them, but they get subsumed under other kinds of ways to think about ethics and we lose them. So I want us to start from scratch and do what Jack Nicklaus did. And then at the end, I'll try to apply this to organizations and business. First of all, I'm going to claim that all of ethics is about one thing, that we frame ethical problems incorrectly a lot of the time, that we often miss that conflict of values or ethical issues are bound up in roles, they're not just sort of theoretical, isolated questions. I'm going to say something really controversial about ethical consistency. I'm going to argue that ethics isn't arbitrary as we sometimes think. Everybody has their own ethics, and so ethics is in some sense squishy. And then I'm going to take on a question that ethicists have talked about since Aristotle, which is, should we make ethical decisions entirely rationally, or is there an emotional component that is worth thinking about? So I'm going to start with my definition of ethics, which again is idiosyncratic. One other thing before I go on. I'm a social scientist, a rare thing for an ethicist to be. Most ethicists are philosophers. In my field of bioethics, they're often clinicians, they're legal scholars. To be a social scientist in ethics is to have a very different view of how we think about ethics, a more pragmatic and applied view than a lot of my colleagues, and that's, I think, going to be reflected in my definition. If you look up ethics, you'll see rules of behavior based on ideas about what is morally good and bad. Ethics is a branch of philosophy. You can get a PhD in ethics in a philosophy department, or we can talk about American ethics or the ethics of some group. But I want to suggest that we think about ethics a little bit differently. And here is my definition, and I threw my definition of morality in there too, because it's complementary. Ethics is how we determine, express, and assess our values in the world, and how we establish, maintain, and conduct our relationships as expressions of those values. Defining ethics like this has a number of practical implications that the rest of my talk is going to try to highlight for you. So it's how we determine, express, and assess our values, and then how we actualize those in terms of our relationship with other people. So start with my claim number 1, that ethics is all about one single thing. So what is that single thing? I do this thought experiment with my students all the time. I'll give you 1 second to think about it. You're in a shipwreck in the middle of the ocean and you notice a rock sticking out of the water. You swim over, you climb up on the rock. You've got nothing. There's no living thing on the rock. There's no, you've got nothing in your pockets. You're just sitting there knowing sooner or later a ship will come by and rescue you. Can you do something unethical while you're sitting there? And I've asked students this hundreds of times, and they come up with 3 categories of things you can do. 1, you can hurt yourself. Interesting question of whether or not that's unethical. You could kill yourself, another interesting thing. And the third, and the only one that I think really might be true, is you could sit there and plot to do something unethical. You could plot someone's murder. And the act of intention there is itself an unethical act, perhaps. But aside from that, people have a really hard time thinking of what they could do unethical sitting on that rock. But the important question about this is not trying to figure something out. The important question about this is, why is it so hard to figure something out? And the reason is because ethics is all about relationships, always. Any ethical question, any ethical situation is about your relationship, usually with another person or group of people, but sometimes with things like the environment. It's unethical perhaps to destroy part of the environment, and that's because of your relationship to the living world. So we might say relationship to living things, except I'm going to tell you a quick anecdote from my time at NASA, where someone there taught me an important lesson. So there's a man at NASA who was there, he's retired now. His name was John Rummel, and he had the best title of any human being. His title at NASA was Chief of Planetary Protection. I mean, what else do you want to tell your kids? I protect planets, honey, that's my job. And he did. If you remember, the Apollo astronauts were quarantined when they came back because we didn't know if there were pathogens on the moon. And when we send ships or probes to other planets, we sterilize them completely because we don't want to inoculate other planets with earthbound bacteria. And so he said to me, my job is to protect the ecosystems of the moon and Mars. And I said to him, okay, Mars I get, but the ecosystem of the moon is a rock. It doesn't have an ecosystem. And he said to me, that may be true, but if I don't think of it as having an ecosystem, I can't protect it. I thought that was a beautiful ethical insight, because what he's saying is if I can't establish a relationship with this planet of some kind, if I just think of it as a rock, and it's hard to have a relationship with a rock, I can't do my job and protect it. I can't approach it with an ethical sensibility. So we have to have a relationship with something to have an ethical responsibility to it. And he was saying I needed to manufacture that. I thought it was a really interesting point, but it just highlights how important relationships are in ethical responsibility. So that's takeaway number one. Ethics is about relationship. Now, takeaway number two is going to be a little longer to get to. And I think we're taught to frame our ethical problems incorrectly. So first thing we all know is that ethics is about values, how we apply and think about values, as was in my definition. So ethics is about all these different values, how we think about them, how we actualize them in our lives. The issue is that when we think about values and then the ethical dilemmas that come out of them, we think about them incorrectly, in my view. We're taught from the beginning, and one of the formal definitions I gave you at the beginning said this also. Ethics is about making decisions about what is blank, and everyone can fill in those blanks about what is right and wrong. Before we move on, a quick important point. Note that ethical dilemmas and the ethics that we engage in our lives is often about making decisions, about decision making, and we'll come back to that later. Ethics is about making decisions about what is right and wrong. Is that correct? Well, I think that's correct in kindergarten. Don't steal, don't hit your sister, whatever it might be, these basic principles, but those are about defining values. When you talk about sophisticated ethical decision making, then it's almost never about right and wrong for adults. So if you think about the ethical problems you've had in your life or in your business, you will see that they are about things like, so I teach physicians, I'm a bioethicist, spend most of my life in healthcare. Doctors often talk about the conflict between honesty and compassion. Are we honest with the patient or are we compassionate? Or if you think about politics in the United States, do we emphasize individual liberty or common good? Isn't that what the whole COVID debate is about in this country? Or again, if you think about not only physicians, though this often comes up with physicians, do we give a patient autonomy? The patient wants to check themselves out against medical advice. Or beneficence, do what's in their best interest. The patient wants a particular treatment. We don't think that treatment is in their best interest. So and we could come up with 100 more examples of these. But what's interesting about this is that none of these are about right versus wrong. Quite the contrary. They're about a conflict in values, but both of those values are valuable. Autonomy and beneficence are both things that are important. Compassion and honesty are both important. Individual liberty and common good are both important. In other words, ethical issues are not about right and wrong. They're about two rights, two values that cannot both be honored. And if you think about the ethical issues in your business or in your life, you will find, if you look at them carefully, that they were almost always about two desirable things, both of which couldn't be honored, but both of which are in and of themselves valuable, positive things. And if you cast ethical decisions as trying to balance two rights or two values instead of a right answer and a wrong answer, you come to much, I think, more sophisticated and defensible and interesting ethical decisions. And you don't cast the person with another point of view as wrong. They just balance things differently. And that's the next important point that I want to get to after how this happens. And the way it happens often, and it's another thing I think we neglect when we think about ethics, is how much our ethical dilemmas that we actually have are embedded in our roles. We have responsibilities based on our roles. I'm a spouse, I'm a parent, I'm a friend, I'm a citizen, I'm an employee, I'm a professor, I'm a mentor, I'm a subordinate to the provost, I'm a superordinate to the workers in my center. And each of those roles that I inhabit, and of course many, many others, have a cluster of values that inhabit them. And very often when we find ourselves in ethical dilemmas, and I think this is just as true in organizations as it is in personal life, it's not because there's some abstract ethical problem, but because we have role conflicts. And they can be your role, responsibility to employees and colleagues versus responsibility to organizations. Again, this is nowhere truer than with physicians who have a fiduciary responsibility to their patients, have a legal obligation to the third-party payers and insurers, and have another legal and employee obligation to the hospital where they're under contract. And those three roles can often conflict, especially in terms of doing what's in the best interest of the patient versus what the insurance company or the hospital policy wants you to do. So those are problems embedded in their different roles. And or your responsibility to your business or versus your responsibility as a citizen. You're working with some country that in which bribe giving and bribe taking is a normal part of business. What's your responsibility there? Now everyone is so dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's causing tension in organizations. So what's our responsibility given various roles in organizations? And these roles, by the way, aren't only formal roles. Sometimes they're informal roles. Some of our colleagues who belong to minority groups are giving the message to their white colleagues, I don't want to be the source of information about diversity, equity, inclusion, just because I'm part of a minority population. That doesn't mean that I have to be the person relied on to point these things out, or the person you come to with questions. So there are different kinds of roles, and we have to tease out what the ethical valence is of those different roles. So the ethical life involves balancing competing ethical responsibilities embedded in roles, and the key is to understand the conflicts and to define ethical responsibilities carefully.
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
We've got a question that I think would be important to address right now. And the question comes from Stephen Esri. What obligation does an employee have when they discover that unethical behavior is actually part of a private company's strategy?
Right. So that's a wonderful question. And I often talk about this with students in a little slightly different context, and that is you find out that your good friend is cheating on an exam. It's another wonderful example of a conflict of values, a conflict of right versus right. Your responsibility of loyalty to a company and your broader social responsibility not to promote and allow unethical behavior. And I've written about this, especially around with scientists, and there are steps you take. It's not just, again, a lot of these decisions are not just black and white. There's steps you take. The first step you take is to find out everything you can about it and find out what the source is of those ideas. Second is to try to intervene yourself if you have the standing and the power and the ability, and to try to alter, change, or at least be a voice for that change to a more ethical stance. Third, if that doesn't work, you have two other choices. You can resign or you can whistleblow. And, the devil's in the details. It's it's easy to say you should always expose it and you should always, your ethical responsibility is always to be a whistleblower. But again, like all other things I'm trying to point out, there are ethical trade-offs that one has to think about in terms of how one responds to those kinds of situations. So yes, it's a very, very difficult situation, and it does require courage. As I said at the beginning, ethics isn't easy, and sometimes you really have to think about, to what degree am I willing to put myself on the line, my job on the line, my family's security on the line, in order to confront or expose an unethical behavior. And by the way, I do think that if it is part of the actual stated strategy of the organization, that's a higher level transgression than when one just finds pockets of unethical behavior, which is often when I get calls in an organization.
Yeah, oh, that's very helpful advice. Thank you. So we've had a couple of folks who've asked that, could you please show the previous slide for just a moment again?
I'm very happy to make these slides available after the after today for Nicola to send out to whoever wants them. So
okay, thank you.
Happy to do that. So the problem of ethical consistency, it's not always a virtue. And this, again, my philosophical colleagues do really disagree with me about this, but I think this is true. We're taught, those of us who actually take ethics courses, and if we read the great ethicists, ethical consistency is considered the only virtue. That is, people come up with systems for making ethical decisions, deontology and consequentialism and virtue ethics. They come up with these systems, and then their point is these will allow you to make always consistent ethical decisions. And my argument is I'm not so sure that we want to make always consistent ethical decisions. What do I mean by that? I'm going to use as my example quickly Peter Singer. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a philosopher at Princeton. He was the founder of the whole animal rights movement on the planet, practically. He wrote the book Animal Liberation. He is a pure utilitarian consequentialist. To him, the consequences of action are all that matters. And he is reviled by the disability rights community because part of his argument has been this: when the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects for a happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. The loss of happy life for the first infant is outweighed by the gain of a happier life for the second. Therefore, if killing, for example, a hemophiliac infant has no adverse effect on others, that's an interesting caveat, it would, according to the total view, be right to kill him. Now, Peter Singer is not arguing that we should engage in infanticide, but he's trying to show how utilitarianism, if it's really taken seriously, would argue, and this has caused people to be really upset with him. But my point here is this is the kind, and I could talk a lot more about this just about Peter Singer, but this is the consequence of taking almost any ethical system to its logical conclusion. So even those that claim fealty to a particular ethical system often hedge that system or bring in a little bit of other ethical systems when that type of ethical decision making reaches the point of extremism or absurdity. Well, if that's true, then perhaps it's better to say that ethics is a toolkit with a number of different tools we can use to make ethical decisions. And we should bring out the proper tool for the kind of ethical decision we're making and not just engage in consistency for consistency's sake. Now, I perfectly understand how very dangerous that claim can be, because what's really easy to do then is know what decision you already want because of self-interest, and then find the ethical system that might lead you to your conclusion that you've already decided you like. And that certainly is a danger, but there's an equal danger in going the other way and saying it always has to be consistent, as Peter Singer's claims about infanticide show us. So we need a balance, and if you approach ethical decisions with integrity, I think you can be more diverse about them. And then number 5, and this is going to bring us back to the values question. Ethics is not arbitrary. I often get questions like, isn't ethics just a matter of opinion? A really interesting question to talk about, is there one ethics for all time, or does ethics change in time and place? Why is there so much ethical controversy? And I want to explain why I think this is true. And if there's one takeaway from this talk I'd like you to think about, it's this one. So first ethics itself. So if you want to see one of the great TED Talks, in my view, see Frans de Waal's TED Talk. Frans de Waal is probably the greatest living primatologist. He was at Emory. He's retired now. And he writes The Origins of Right and Wrong in Humans and Other Animals, in which he makes the claim that animals often have to make ethical decisions. His TED Talk shows films of animals where experimenters have put them in ethical dilemmas, and the animals have to make ethical decisions, because any social animal, this may not be true of polar bears, but any social animal, any animal that lives in groups, has to figure out how to distribute scarce goods, how to mate with desirable companions. And in order to do that, there has to be consensus around the group of how you distribute food, how you determine mating. And those are ethical decisions. So the kernel of human ethical decision making starts very early in social animals. Then Paul Bloom at Yale, did experiments in infants, 6 months old, puts them in front of these stick figures, movies, where one stick figure hits another stick figure, knocks them down, and takes the ball they're playing with. And what he discovered is that even in young infants, there is a rudimentary sense of fairness. And by watching eye tracking, by putting cameras that watch where these babies move their eyes when they show these types of films, it shows their upsetness with the wronged figure, and they're tracking the wronged figure much longer than the figure that's done the wrong, presumably in order to make sure they're okay, or to see what the results of this unfairness are. It's very sophisticated work, and I'm not doing it justice. But the point of me showing you these two books is to say the rudimentary parts of fairness, the idea of doing the right thing is, in one way or another, it's there in animals, it's there in infants. What we do as we grow is not teach children that there is ethics. It's that we refine their innate ethical sense by making sure that they have the right values to make good ethical decisions. And to show this in the broader context, here's just a sort of impressionistic graph rather than one based on specific data. If you think about the ethical issues on the bottom axis, solidarity, autonomy, duty, fairness, and transparency, and then you think about regions of the world, what you discover is that all of these regions believe in all of these things. That is, ethics is universal. The ethical categories are universal. Everyone believes in duty, everyone believes in fairness, everyone believes in autonomy, everyone believes in solidarity. But different cultures, even different subcultures within a single culture, weigh them differently when they are in conflict. So if you think of the idea of solidarity and duty, very, very strong and high in Asian countries, while lower, relatively speaking, especially solidarity in the Western world. Well, if you look at autonomy, of course, the Western world highly values autonomy, but when it comes to a conflict between individual liberty or autonomy and social good, if you can see that the USA and Western Europe value them very, very highly, while in Asian countries, many Asian countries, they subordinate individual autonomy to common good. The point isn't which is right or which is better, that's a matter of argument. The point is that when you have an ethical dilemma, if it's about a right versus a right, and balancing two values and deciding how you're going to weight each value, the reason we have different ethics in different places is not because they're arbitrary, but because people have systems of weights that are internally consistent that they apply, but those weights can be different. Whether you value a good like autonomy or a good like solidarity is an important ethical question, but there isn't a right or a wrong answer to that. So this message that I'm trying to make overall is rights versus rights, values and conflicts is what ethics is about, and how we weight those values in making ethical decisions is what ethics is.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
There's an interesting question that might fit in here, actually, on the previous slide. Is there such a thing as ethics without sentience?
No, I don't think there is. I mean, if there was no sentience at all, then who is making the ethical decision, and what ethical decision are we making? This almost gets us to the question of So how do some people answer that question? They answer the question by saying ethics in its ultimate sense resides in the mind of God. God is ubiquitous and omniscient and omnipotent, and therefore the universe is suffused with ethics because there is a fundamental sentience that runs the universe, and therefore ethics is always a part of that equation. If you don't accept that premise that there is a God, then ethics without sentience has very little meaning. There's no ethics on Jupiter. And there's no ethics amongst ants. So, I mean, we could go, that's a very deep and important question that there's a lot of conversation we could have about, but that's my quick answer. And then the final point I want to make, and then I'm just going to make a few points about business and then open it up for discussion. So Kant, one of the greatest thinkers in history about ethics, wrote very clearly about emotion. He said, emotion has no place in ethics at all. You need to make rational decisions about ethical actions. Actions motivated even by positive emotions like love or sympathy have no positive moral worth. If I help someone because I love them, according to Kant, that help is not ethically worthwhile because I'm helping them because I love them. If I didn't love them, maybe I wouldn't help them. So his point is that those emotions stand in the way of genuine moral acts, which must be carried out purely from the rational recognition and duty to what he calls the moral law. So if I let emotions guide how I behave ethically, according to Kant, I'm going to be arbitrary because people I like, I'll be good to, people I don't like, I won't be good to. And that's not an ethical life. An ethical life is to rationally decide what the ethical thing is to do here and then to do it, no matter what my emotions are about it, and no matter how much I like or dislike the person involved. And that's a compelling argument. But I want to argue that, in fact, I have a whole separate talk about this, so I'm boiling that down into one slide, that in fact, emotions are not only important, but it's how we usually make ethical decisions. And I'll tell you that in a moment with a quick talk about the trolley problem, which you've heard of. Aristotle said emotions are part of moral reasoning and have to be part of moral deliberation. And even today, we brought the Dalai Lama to Emory a few years ago, and he was there to talk about what he calls secular ethics, which is his idea that everyone believes in compassion. All major religions believe in compassion. Philosophical views of ethics that are non-religious believe in compassion. So why don't we start from compassion as our fundamental assumption and value and build a universal ethic from there? Well, compassion is an emotional state, not an intellectual state. And so virtue ethics argues that emotions are part of moral decision-making. Really quickly, I want to take a quick diversion just to make that point. Many of you, I'm sure, probably most of you have heard of the trolley problem. I'm going to go through it very quickly. A trolley is going down the tracks. 5 people are tied to one spur. One person's tied to the other spur. That's you with your hand over your eyes near the switch. That trolley is going to kill those 5 people by going down the right-hand spur. You can switch in to go down the left-hand spur from our view. You will be directly causing the death of the person in the pink shirt, salmon colored shirt. But you will be saving the 5 people on the right. Do you pull the switch? If you ask groups of people, about 80 to 90% say they would pull the switch. And when you ask them why, very, very simple answer. I'm saving 5, causing the death of 1. And so it's better to save 5 people than kill 1. That's a utilitarian, consequentialist answer. But what makes trolley interesting is the second question. Now you're standing on a bridge, a trellis over the track. The train is coming. It's going to kill those 5 people. On top of the track is a very fat, heavy man. And we make it that way because you can't jump off and stop this trolley. You don't have the bulk. If you push that fat man off the bridge, he will fall in front of the trolley. The trolley will hit him, kill him, and stop, and you'll save those 5. Don't question the premise. It's a thought experiment. Would you push the fat man off the bridge? If you notice this book, would you kill the fat man? That's what it's asking. And interestingly, of the 80 to 90% of people that would pull the switch, 70 to 85% say they would not push the fat man off the bridge. But that doesn't make sense from a utilitarian point of view. In both cases, you're killing one to save five. So why wouldn't you do both? And this has become a cottage industry. There's a field called trolleyology. There are 1,000 different variations to this. But the fundamental insight that Josh Green and Jonathan Cohen from Princeton, who did this work, showed by putting this question been around for a long time, but they put people in an MRI and explored it, was that the decision about pulling the switch was made with the prefrontal cortex, with the rational, reasonable part of the brain. When we talked about pushing a fat man off the bridge, the limbic system lit up. The limbic system is the emotional part of the brain. And that just highlighted how we make certain decisions rationally and certain decisions emotionally, and they're not necessarily consistent. And we have to think through that question. So quick couple comments about business, and then we'll open it up. So where does ethics belong? We often put ethics in business in one of these three places, in either the legal department or compliance, more often in HR somewhere. And nowadays we wrap it up with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, if you think about the elements of ethics that I talked about, HR is about relationships. That's what human relations is. It's about our human relationships within an organization. So when we choose HR, we're choosing relationships. When we choose DEI, we're going deeply for values, because DEI is a value enterprise. We care about diversity, diversity, equity, and inclusion because it's unfair otherwise, and it's against our values to discriminate against people. If we do legal compliance, it's rules and regulations. There's a right and wrong decision-making. Follow this rule, not to follow it is wrong. So as we fragment ethics in an organization, we're actually choosing one component of ethics to emphasize with where we locate it. And my suggestion and my question and my emphasis is, where does ethics really belong? Ethics belongs in the C-suite. That is, ethics has to be a value that starts with the valued decision makers of an organization, which are the leadership, the executives, and then has to pervade the organization from the top all the way to the bottom, which itself causes certain issues. So my final 2 slides with 6 quick points. First, 3 takeaways, and then 3 skills. So first, all organizations communicate their values and their ethics, whether explicitly or implicitly. You can never explicitly talk about values, but through your actions, the way you treat employees, what employees are taught to do and not do, values and ethics are always being communicated. Every decision we make actually communicates values. The real dilemma comes, and I often get calls when the values being articulated and espoused by the leadership are different than the ones that are either communicated by middle management. Yes, we're supposed to be ethical, but if you don't make your quota this month, you won't get your bonus, etc. So in other words, do anything you can, despite all the lofty rhetoric of our leadership. You need to go out and sell, those kinds of ethical dilemmas in an organization, and there are many different kinds, are a real source of stress and employee dissatisfaction. And then the third point takeaway is, a lot of people think of ethics as compliance. In a lot of organizations, you have a chief compliance officer who is the ethics officer and does not themselves often understand the difference between compliance and ethics. And it's really important in an organization to tease out the difference between compliance and ethics and have a strong ethics program, not just a compliance program. One other little point, ethics isn't just about saying, don't do that. Ethics isn't about saying no. That's a very small part of what I hope ethics does. Ethics is about clarifying values. And so to build an ethical culture, and this is my last slide, you have to make good ethical decisions, especially in strategic decision-making. Ethics is about strategic planning. Second, it's a skill. It can be learned. We train people in ethics. We train boards. We train management. We train line workers. We train any groups to how to identify, analyze, think about, and make ethical decisions. And then finally, ethics doesn't just flow down from the top, it has to also flow up from the bottom. Ethical decision making that's made at the most fundamental employee level reflect back up on the organization. It is often the forward-facing or public-facing part. So ethics has to be a conversation. So I hope there was, I hope something that I said sparked some thought on your part, and I'm delighted to take questions now.
Thanks so much, Paul. We do have quite a lot of questions, so let me pose some of them to you.
Sure.
The first one from Gary Bombs: ethics part of a person's lifelong learning, or are ethics part of the DNA of a person? And I want to add on something else to that, because of some of your last comments, which were around that ethics is part of the value system. And then it feels to me like values change over time. My values are different to my grandparents' values. And so how does that sort of come into play?
Right. So two great questions. First, let me take your question about values. Your values haven't changed over time. How you weight your values have changed over time. So if you ask the young Nicola, do you believe in freedom, personal, you would say yes to all of those things. But if I said to you, what happens when individual freedom conflicts with this other value, your answer might be different now than it was then. So when we say values change to an ethicist, we have to tease that out. Our fundamental values stay the same, just like culture's values stay the same. What moves all the time and changes minute to minute is how we think about weighting those values against one another when they're in conflict, or sometimes just which value to emphasize in our life. And so our balance of values change. And that brings me to the first question. Is eating in our DNA, or do we learn about eating throughout our life? Well, hunger is part of the human condition. And but if you look at Japanese cuisine and you look at Greek cuisine, they're two very, very different things. If you think about eating dog in Southeast Asia, you might think of it as a delicacy. If I fed you some meat and you didn't know what it was, and then I told you it was dog, now think about this. This is a fascinating thing. You might actually throw up. That's fascinating, isn't it? I put the word dog in your mind, and your mind sent a message to your stomach to engage in reverse peristalsis and empty itself of this idea that I put in your mind. That's how powerful the learning about eating is, even though hunger itself is fundamental. And my argument would be the same about ethics. We're born with an innate sense of fairness, but all the details and all the balances and all the cultural weights of that fundamental impulse are taught over a lifetime and do change and evolve as we grow.
So that is fascinating. I'm curious. In fact, it leads on to another question by Denise Conklin. What are the core factors about transparency that makes this value consistent across cultures, geographic locations, etc.? What and how does this, one particular value play in and or balance out sort of business rationality in decision making?
Yeah. So transparency in business is now accepted throughout. It wasn't always true, and it isn't true culturally. So transparency means honesty, right? It means saying things as they are, and then there's an added element of no lies by omission, right? You have to. But in many cultures, social life is run by social lying. And what I mean by that is, in many cultures, there are ritual ways you lie that everyone understands are ritualized and everyone understands are lying, but it's part of the social lubrication. And we do it too. We tell social lies. Yes, your infant is the cutest infant I've ever seen.
Well,
and then you turn to your
true,
spouse and of course, then you turn to your spouse and say, what a homely baby, right? I mean, so we lubricate social life with little white lies. And in other cultures, they take that to a greater point. I used to teach in my medical sociology class, I used to show this film of what happened up until very recently, and still is true in some places in Japan, and still true very much in other cultures. The major cancer hospital outside of Tokyo engaged in a systematic and ubiquitous process of lying, because the Japanese culture didn't believe that people should be told they had cancer, because if they were told they had cancer, they would they would despair and lose a will to live. So there were nurses whose entire jobs were to write down the lies that were told to patients, so that when doctors walked into a room, they would read the notes and be consistent in the lies that were told to patients. So lies were told to patients, the truth was told to their family. And then the family took care of the patient. The patient was told they had ulcers, the family was told they had stomach cancer. So now, if you think about it, these weren't stupid people. They knew what chemotherapy was, and they knew you didn't get chemotherapy for ulcers. But even the patient maintained the lie, because it was part of the system of ritual lying, I call it. So transparency isn't quite as ubiquitous as we think it is. What has happened is, as we turn to a Western style of business that is a contract-based business, the whole, and much business was not contractual in history, it was relational. But in a contractual set of business, you have to be transparent. A contract has to be honest. A contract has to lay out all the terms, and a contract, has to not have hidden components to it. And so as the Western model of business spread throughout the world, transparency in business had to spread throughout the world. Relations were no longer enough. And so, and that's the reason. There's still parts of the world where relational business is done internally and contractual business is done externally. And in those places, there's two models of transparency.
So another question from Carl Barham. What tools or tactics are most effective to change individual ethics, to change the ethics of groups of people, society and organization? And I'm going to add another question onto that. And who gets to decide that? Who gets to decide that your ethics needs to change, or the team ethics need to change?
So that's a tough question, because it's very different depending on who you're talking about. So in a democracy, the citizenship through voting gets to decide what the values are. And you will often hear groups say, and this is happening right now, but it's happened many times in history, we're fighting for the soul of America. The next election will determine the soul, because there's one set of values against another. In an organization, that is what leadership is for. Leadership's purpose is to determine the value set of the organization, which doesn't mean that oftentimes that impetus doesn't come from workers pushing it up to the leadership, or that workers might not themselves develop a value system separate from the leadership. But that's a problem that shows an organizational challenge. How do you determine it? Well, you can determine it paternalistically, and you can get together in a conference room and have the executives there and they say, okay, here are the values, or you can determine it democratically and do it with your whole group. But the question of how you change culture, I'm a sociologist, that's one of the things we study, very, very tough one. There's no better example that I like to give than NASA, because I was at NASA, as you know, and back about 30 years ago, a little more, the Challenger disaster happened. Why did the Challenger disaster happen? With the O-rings exploding, because the engineers who thought that might happen, who were against the rocket firing under those conditions, tried to get that message up to the leadership and were blocked at a certain middle management level. NASA put in a whole culture change program for many, many years after that. When the Columbia disaster happened, and I was at NASA when that happened, it was the same problem. It was frozen foam coming off the booster rockets striking, in this case, the leading edge wing of the Columbia. The exact same thing was true. Engineers had worried and talked to management about the problem of foam strikes for years, but now there had been 100, I think Columbia was 113 or something like that. There had been 100 missions without it happening, so they got complacent. But here you have an organization that undergone the worst tragedy in its history, tries to make change, and then the second equally worst tragedy in its history happens for exactly the same reason. Institutional change is really, really hard to make. And the problem is that that processes in organizations become reified, they become embedded. And the only way to change them is you can't tweak them into change. You have to fundamentally change process. You have to rebuild them from the bottom up in order to really institute change. And that's why, DEI, for example, has to be more than just a few seminars. If you don't change fundamental processes, which by the way, includes leadership processes, not just worker processes. If you don't improve them, rebuild them, think of them in fundamental ways, then institutional culture just isn't going to change. It's a tough road to change institutional culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nicola, we've got time for about one more question.
Okay, thanks, Pam. So I have two. So maybe we can do it quickly.
Yeah, I'll do it quickly.
Act ethically with a pragmatic but not a moral underpinning for your decision making or actions, or is that just situational pragmatism?
Okay, that's what I mean. I'm going to take just a little bit more time. I promise not too much more time, Pam. Josh Knobe, who is a psychologist, has this wonderful example he likes to give, and I'm going to do it real quickly. Scenario one, man goes to his CEO and he says, I've got this wonderful thing. It's going to make us, I'm shortening this. It's going to make us a lot of money, but it's going to harm the environment. The CEO says, sorry, wait, am I getting this right? Yes, I'm going to harm the environment. The CEO says, I don't care about harming the environment. I just care about making money. Do it. They do it, and it harms the environment. Is the CEO culpable for having harmed the environment? And everybody says yes. Most people say yes. It's his fault. He knew it was going to happen. Then you do the exact same scenario, exact same wording, and you just change one word. Man comes to a CEO. He says, I've got this process. It'll make us a lot of money and it will help the environment. The CEO says, I don't care at all about helping the environment. I just want to make money. Do it. They do it and it helps the environment. Should the CEO get credit for helping the environment? And most people say no. Well, why is it that you want to give the CEO culpability for the harm, but you don't want to give the CEO credit for the positive outcome when the CEO's attitude in both were exactly equivalent? Mm-hmm. And that's because we think of harm differently than we think of help. Harm can be irreversible while help is often proximate, right? If I injure myself seriously, that can affect the rest of my life, right? While a certain amount of help to me probably won't affect the rest of my life. And so it raises an interesting question, not about whether that's true that people can engage ethically without a moral intention, but how we think about people engaging without a moral intention. And I'll just leave it there.
And so my last question is, moving away from people making the decisions, is it possible to teach AI to make ethical decisions? And should AI be programmed and or taught to be sensitive to the values of individuals or groups?
So I have a whole talk on that, many, in fact, 2 or 3
So we have to invite you back, Paul.
You have to invite me back. In fact, I thought about giving that talk this morning, but decided to give this one instead. I'm speaking to the National Automated Vehicle Group. I'm their keynote speaker in a few weeks. It's in Atlanta this time, on that very question. Can we teach AI to make ethical decisions? And the answer is yes, but not the way we think about ethical decisions. There's a whole schema of how we have to do it. It's very complex and difficult question. So if that's enough of a teaser, I'm happy to come back and give you that talk too.
That sounds wonderful. So thank you so much for your time today, and thank everybody who participated in the webinar. I'm going to hand it over to Pam.
Great. Thank you, Nicola. And thank you again, Paul. Such a great topic, and one that we really haven't explored before. And so it was nice to have something completely different from some of our other Business Over Breakfast sessions, and gives us provocative food for thought, frankly. Oftentimes some things we haven't thought about since my college days, frankly. So I want to share a little bit about what's coming up next for our Business Over Breakfast. Our next one, we have shifted to the first and third Thursdays of the month. So our next one will be hosted by David Schwadel on driving growth with content analysis. And it is always intriguing to hear from David. And then in September, we have our 2 sessions. First, a revisit on our business model innovations. And then on September the 16th, we'll be talking about breakthrough change, overcoming your immunity to change. It is introducing some topics that can be revisited in a workshop style. And then we want to share with you, it is back to school time. So Justin, if you can move forward one more slide for me. We are excited to share with you that we have a great opportunity for you to join us during this back to school time with a special promotion code of B2S, as in back to school, and receive 15% off registration for our upcoming courses. That code will be valid until September the 9th. So hurry and jump onto our website and check out to see if there are any courses you'd like to join us in. As you see here on the screen, we've got executive communications, design thinking for business innovation, and disrupting your business strategy. Also around our finance and accounting for non-financial managers and executive decision-making. Some of those we hope will be able to be held in person, but that will be subject to the current COVID guidelines at the time those courses are held. Others are held live online, so we hope to see you there. Thank you again for joining us this morning. And we thank you for Paul joining us as well. We hope and invite you to complete the short survey that will show up on your screen immediately after the conclusion of the webinar. Your feedback is so valuable to us and has helped us shape some of our work as we head into the hopefully post-COVID world. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you on our next session on August the 19th. Take care, everyone.